Welcome back, everyone. In this deep dive, we'll be exploring Ray-Kurzweil's 2024 book, The-Singularity-Is-Nearer.
Mm,
Specifically, we'll be focusing on how he sees information technology as driving force for progress
okay.
across really a broad range of fields, from like AI and biotechnology to energy and social trends.
Yeah, makes sense.
So to start, why don't we look at the historical trends in computing power?
Okay, sure. Kurzweil really centers his thesis around this idea called the law of accelerating returns. It's also known as low AR.
Okay, so low AR, what is that exactly, and why is it so important for us to understand how technology is progressing?
Well, basically, LAR says that technologies that help us better process and understand information, they actually create this cycle where every advancement leads to even faster progress.
So it's not like a straight line of progress, it's more exponential.
Right. Like imagine a river slowly eroding a stone.
Okay.
One drop of water doesn't really do much. But over time, that constant force can transform the stone completely.
I see. So it's like small changes building up over time to create these massive shifts.
Exactly. And this is like what Darwin saw with evolution, right?
Right.
Small, gradual changes can eventually result in these huge leaps in complexity and ability. And when you apply this principle to technology, you can see how seemingly small advancements can actually lead to some pretty groundbreaking innovations.
But we shouldn't underestimate the power of those small advancements.
Definitely not. And LOAR helps us really grasp that. It helps us move beyond this like linear way of thinking and see that rapid transformative change, it really could be just around the corner.
Okay, that's a good point. So we've talked about this general idea of accelerating returns,
hmm
but how does this apply to something specific, like artificial intelligence?
Well, AI is actually a central part of Kurzweil's predictions, and he actually traces the whole evolution of AI all the way back to the early days, starting with these things called connectionist models.
Connectionist models.
Yeah. Back in the 1960s, you had things like Rosenblatt's perceptron, and these were like the very foundation for modern AI.
And what exactly did these early models, what were they able to do?
Well, they were basically networks of these super simple processing units. But the key thing is they were able to learn from data and even identify patterns in that data.
Okay, so they weren't that smart, but they were able to lay the groundwork for what was to come.
Exactly. And then the real breakthrough came with multi-layered neural
And
networks.
those allowed for even deeper learning and more complex analysis, right?
Yeah. And as our computing power increased, researchers could build even more complex AI systems. And this ultimately led to these things called transformer models.
Transformer models. Now, those are the things behind some of the really advanced AI we're seeing today, right?
Right, like think about Palomy.
Palomy.
Kurzweil uses it as this really interesting example. It's a system where they put the AI in a robot, right? And it can actually understand and follow these really complicated instructions. Like you could tell it to get a specific object from a drawer, and it can actually do it.
That's pretty amazing. So it's not just thinking, it's actually interacting with the physical world.
Exactly. And so these advancements, they show how fast AI is progressing and how integrated it's becoming with our lives. But then, of course, this brings up the whole question of what happens to jobs in the future. What happens when AI starts to replace human workers?
Yeah, that's a big question. And one that Kurzweil addresses head on in his book, right? He compares it to other periods of history where technology has changed the job market.
Right. He brings up things like the Luddite movement.
Mm-hmm.
And he basically argues that, yes, some jobs will definitely be automated, but new industries and job roles will appear too. He points to the decline of farm jobs and factory jobs in the U.S., starting in the 1800s. But at the same time, the overall workforce actually grew.
So the concern isn't necessarily that jobs will disappear altogether. It's more about how those jobs will change and what new jobs will emerge.
Yeah. And then there's also this paradox Kurzweil talks about, the missing productivity paradox.
The missing productivity paradox.
Yeah. So technology is supposed to make us more productive, right? But why isn't that reflected in greater economic growth?
That's a good point. So where's that extra productivity going?
Well, Kurzweil suggests that maybe our traditional ways of measuring economic progress, they just don't really capture the full impact of information technology, especially because it tends to make things cheaper.
So like the more affordable and powerful information technology gets, the less it seems to show up in things like GDP.
Exactly. So we might need to rethink how we measure economic progress.
Hmm. Okay, that's interesting. So we've talked about jobs, but Kurzweil also dives into some even more futuristic ideas, like extending our minds into the cloud using brain-computer interfaces. What exactly does he mean by that?
Well, imagine being able to connect your neocortex.
Your
Yeah,
neocortex.
the part of your brain that handles all those high-level thinking processes, connect it directly to the cloud. And that would essentially expand your cognitive abilities tremendously.
That's a pretty mind-blowing concept.
Mhm.
But how would that even be possible?
Well, it would require overcoming some pretty big technical hurdles. Kurzweil thinks nanobots might be the key.
Nanobots. Those are like microscopic robots, right?
Yeah, they could potentially interact with our brains at a cellular level.
So basically, we'd have tiny robots operating inside our brains, helping us connect to the cloud.
Yeah. Sounds a bit crazy, right? But then this raises all sorts of philosophical questions about consciousness.
Yeah, like what would happen to our sense of self if we could extend our minds like that? Would we still be us?
Exactly. If you could create a perfect replica of your brain in the cloud, would that replica also have your consciousness? Would it be you?
Those are some big questions, and probably ones we'll need to start grappling with sooner rather than later as technology keeps advancing.
Definitely. And those questions are really at the heart of the next part of our deep dive, where we'll be exploring these philosophical and ethical aspects in more detail. And, this idea of consciousness extending into the cloud, it gets even more interesting when you consider the evidence from medicine, the idea that our brains might actually have multiple decision-making units.
Multiple decision-making units.
Yeah, Kurzweil brings up these studies on split brain patients.
Oh, right, where the two hemispheres of the brain have been surgically separated.
Right, and these studies suggest that the two hemispheres, they can actually function kind of independently, even develop different personalities.
Yeah, that's right. So it's like two minds in one head.
Exactly. And that lends some support to the idea that maybe consciousness isn't this one single thing, but could potentially exist across multiple structures, even if they're physically separate.
So if our brains are already kind of wired for multiple decision-making units, maybe extending consciousness into the cloud wouldn't be as big a leap as we might think.
It's a possibility. Kurzweil seems to think so. And he also dives into the work of this physicist, Stephen Wolfram.
Oh yeah, Wolfram. He's the one who came up with that classification system for different types of computational systems, right? Including those cellular automata.
Exactly. And those are pretty fascinating. You have these simple computational models, but they can generate incredibly complex patterns. It suggests that even deterministic systems can lead to emergent properties that are really unpredictable.
Okay, I'm following. So even though the universe might follow these fixed rules, those rules can result in outcomes that are much more complex than the rules themselves.
Right. And Wolfram believes that our universe might operate on similar principles. So even though it follows deterministic laws, there are these emergent properties that can't be easily reduced to those laws.
So it's not just about the basic building blocks, it's about how they interact and the complexity that arises from those interactions.
Right. And Kurzweil links this back to consciousness, suggesting that our brains might generate consciousness as this emergent property of their own complex computations.
So if we could replicate those computations, even outside of a biological brain, could we also replicate consciousness?
Now that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And one that's still being debated by philosophers and scientists alike. But it's a question that becomes even more important as we start to talk about things like biotechnology and its potential to really revolutionize health and longevity.
Yeah, that's another area where AI is playing a huge role, right?
Absolutely. And Kurzweil highlights just how much potential AI have to accelerate progress in fields like drug discovery, personalized medicine, and even, radical life extension. He talks about AI's ability to analyze these massive data sets and identify patterns that humans might miss, like, for example, in predicting protein folding.
Oh, right, like with AlphaFold, that AI system that can accurately predict the 3D structure of proteins.
Exactly. That was a huge breakthrough. And it has all sorts of implications for developing new drugs and understanding diseases better.
And AI is also being used to analyze medical images, right?
Yeah, like Kurzweil mentions the system called ChexNet, which can look at chest x-rays and detect pneumonia even better than some human radiologists.
Wow. And then there's the whole area of surgical robots and how they're becoming more and more autonomous.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, although it does raise some concerns about the future of surgery and, what role humans will play.
Definitely. But Kurzweil also points out the potential benefits of these robots, like increased precision, fewer errors, and better access to surgery for people in remote areas.
It's all about finding the right balance, right?
Right. And then we have these medical nanorobots that Kurzweil calls the third bridge to radical life extension.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild idea. He envisions these tiny robots traveling around inside our bodies, repairing damage at the cellular level, boosting our immune systems, maybe even replacing failing organs.
So basically, nanorobots could be the key to living much longer and healthier lives.
That's the hope. But of course, nanotechnology is still in its early stages.
And there's some potential dangers too, right? Like that whole gray goo scenario where self-replicating nanobots consume all matter on Earth.
Yeah, that's a scary thought. But Kurzweil addresses that concern. He proposes these safeguards, like a broadcast architecture, where the nanorobots wouldn't carry their own programming, but instead would receive instructions from a central source that could be shut down if needed.
So it's like having a kill switch for the nanobots.
Exactly. And this idea of responsible development is something that Kurzweil emphasizes throughout the book. We need to approach these technologies cautiously and think about the ethical implications.
And that's a good point, because even though there are risks, Kurzweil also reminds us of the amazing progress humanity has made in so many areas.
Right. He talks about literacy rates going up, poverty going down, life expectancy increasing, violence decreasing. These are all positive trends.
So even as we worry about the potential dangers of technology, we shouldn't lose sight of the progress we've made.
Definitely not. And Kurzweil's point is that information technology, the same force driving AI and nanotechnology, has also been a major driver of that progress.
So it's all about how we use that technology.
Exactly. And that brings us back to that question of what happens when we create a perfect replica of our brains? Is that replica really us?
It's a profound question.
Yeah.
Would we be transferring our consciousness, or would it be more like creating a very advanced simulation?
We don't have those answers yet. But as we develop these technologies, those questions are going to become more and more pressing. And it's questions like those that lead us into the next part of our deep dive, where we'll be looking at the potential risks and challenges of artificial superintelligence.
So as we wrap up our look at the singularity is nearer, let's talk about the potential downsides. What are some of the risks that Kurzweil points out, especially when it comes to this idea of superintelligent AI? It feels like we're getting into science fiction territory here.
Yeah, it's true. The idea of AI becoming smarter than humans has been around in science fiction forever. But now, with AI advancing so rapidly, it's starting to feel like a real possibility, something we need to prepare for. And Kurzweil doesn't shy away from the risks involved.
Yeah, he talks a lot about the potential for misuse, whether it's intentional or accidental.
He lays out all these different concerns, from self-replicating nanobots causing chaos to AI systems being used for harmful purposes like autonomous weapons. He really paints a vivid picture of what could go wrong if we're not careful.
It sounds like the stakes are incredibly high. We're not just talking about jobs disappearing, we're talking about potential threats to humanity itself.
Exactly. Kurzweil is very clear about that. He says the consequences of losing control of superintelligent AI could be catastrophic. That's why he stresses the need for ethical guidelines and safeguards to minimize those risks.
So what does he suggest we do to address these challenges?
Well, he's a big advocate for developing ethical frameworks for AI development, like the Asilomar AI principles, which were put together by some of the top AI researchers and ethicists.
I've heard of those. They cover a pretty wide range of issues, right?
Yeah, things like transparency, value alignment, safety, security. The goal is to make sure that AI is developed and used for good, not for harm.
It sounds good in theory, but how do we actually control an AI that's way smarter than us? It seems like a tough problem to solve.
There's no easy answer, that's for sure. Kurzweil admits that. But he suggests exploring things like a broadcast architecture for AI, similar to what he proposes for nanobots.
So the AI wouldn't be completely independent. Its instructions would come from a central source that humans control.
Right. That way, we'd have some level of oversight and the ability to intervene if things go wrong. But of course, this raises another question. How do we make sure the humans in control are acting ethically and responsibly?
It seems like we need some pretty robust systems of governance and oversight to manage all of this.
We definitely would. Kurzweil argues that we need to strengthen our social institutions, make sure we're making ethical decisions, and work to ensure that these technologies benefit all of humanity, not just a select few.
It's a tall order. But despite all these potential dangers, Kurzweil still seems optimistic about the future.
He does. He believes that if we approach these technologies with wisdom and careful planning, we can use them to create a much better world, a world with more abundance, better health, even expanded consciousness.
It's a reminder that the future isn't set in stone. We have the power to shape it with our choices and actions.
Right. And even though the path ahead is likely to be full of challenges, Kurzweil's book gives us some valuable tools to help us navigate this uncertain terrain. It encourages us to have these important conversations, to think critically about the ethical implications of our technological choices, and to work together to build a future that aligns with our values and
The
aspirations.
Singularity is Nearer is definitely a book that makes you think. It challenges our assumptions about the future and encourages us to imagine what's possible.
It's a great read, and I think anyone who's interested in the future of technology and humanity will find something valuable in its pages.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into The Singularity is Nearer. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking, and we hope you'll continue to explore these fascinating and crucial topics long after this deep dive is over.